She was 16 years old when she disappeared from the surface of the world. Not the kind of disappearing that makes the news. No Amber Alert, no search parties fanning out across empty fields, no candlelight vigils in a school gymnasium. The kind of disappearing that happens when nobody is looking for you, when the people who should be looking are the reason you left. She went down into the earth with $37, a flashlight with dying batteries, a sleeping bag that smelled of mildew, and something else. Something she hadn't told a single person about, not even the girl at school who'd given her the test. 6 months later, when a retired postal worker named Gerald Haynes followed his dog into the woods behind the old Pruitt property on a Tuesday morning in October, he heard something that stopped him cold. It wasn't an animal. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic, too human. A sound rising from somewhere below the ground. He expected to find a lost hiker, maybe. A teenager who'd fallen into a drainage culvert. What he found instead was a girl who had built a life in the dark, and a reason she had refused to return to the light. Her name was Cassidy Ann Merritt, and she was born on a Thursday in late November in a county hospital in eastern Tennessee, in a room that smelled of antiseptic and floor wax, to a woman named Lena, who was 22 years old and already exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the labor. Lena Merritt was the kind of woman who had been pretty once in a way that life had not been gentle with. High cheekbones and dark eyes that had once been animated with something close to joy, now carrying a flatness that the people who knew her had simply stopped noticing. She raised Cassidy in a rented house on Caldwell Street in a small town called Hatcher's Creek, population 3,400, a place where everyone knew your business and nobody helped with it. The house was yellow, or had been yellow once. The paint had faded and peeled back to a grayish bone white by the time Cassidy was old enough to notice it, the wooden siding warping slightly at the corners like something trying to curl away from the world. There was a porch with 2 steps, one of which rocked when you stepped on it. There was a yard with a patch of grass that Lena sometimes cut and sometimes let grow until the neighbors left notes. There was a kitchen with a window over the sink that faced west, and on summer evenings, the light came through it golden and warm, and turned the whole room the color of honey. And this was the detail Cassidy would hold on to later, for years, for decades, when she needed to remember that there had been goodness in that house, that there had been moments, that it had not always been what it became. For the first 9 years of her life, it was just the 2 of them, and that was enough. Lena worked the early shift at a packaging facility 12 miles outside town, leaving before Cassidy woke and returning by mid-afternoon with the particular smell of industrial grease and machine oil that Cassidy would ever after associate with safety. Lena was not a demonstrative woman. She did not read bedtime stories or bake birthday cakes or use the word love easily, but she showed up. Every day she showed up. She packed lunches. She showed up at parent-teacher conferences still in her work clothes, still smelling of the factory, her hair pulled back in a bun that had loosened over the course of the shift. She bought Cassidy secondhand books from the church sale and left them in stacks beside her bed. She taught her to make biscuits from scratch and to check the oil in a car and to never let a man see you cry if you could help it. She was not a perfect mother. She was an exhausted one. And for 9 years, in that yellow house on Caldwell Street, with the golden evening light in the kitchen, Cassidy was safe. His name was Dale Pruitt, and he arrived in their lives the way most disasters do, gradually and then all at once. Lena met him at a 4th of July cookout at someone's backyard and came home flushed and younger looking than she had in years, and Cassidy, who was 9, noticed the change in her mother the way animals notice changes in barometric pressure, with a wordless, instinctive unease. Dale was 38 and broad-shouldered, with a square jaw and a way of laughing at his own jokes before he'd finished telling them. He wore clean boots and paid for things without checking prices, and drove a truck that was only 2 years old. And in Hatcher's Creek in 1997, these were not small things. He owned a parcel of land outside of town, 32 acres, mostly woods, with a cabin on it that his father had built and that Dale maintained with the particular pride of a man who needed to own something. He had worked in logging for 12 years and now ran a small equipment rental operation out of a yard on the county road. He was not poor. This was significant to Lena in ways she never articulated, but that Cassidy understood even then, in the wordless, skin-deep way of children who have watched their mothers worry about money every day of their lives. Dale and Lena were married 14 months after the 4th of July cookout, on a Saturday morning in the courthouse with Cassidy as the only witness, wearing a dress that Lena had bought her at Kmart and that itched at the collar. In the photograph from that day, the only photograph, Lena is smiling with her whole face, the flatness entirely gone, her dark eyes alight in a way Cassidy had never seen before and would not see again. Dale has his arm around Lena's shoulder, heavy and proprietary. Cassidy stands slightly to the side, holding a small bunch of daisies someone has given her, her expression politely blank in the way of children who have already learned to hide what they feel. They moved into Dale's cabin on the Pruitt land 3 weeks later, leaving the yellow house on Caldwell Street behind. Cassidy cried in the car, quietly, facing the window so no one would see. She did not know, on that drive, exactly what she was crying for. She would understand it later. She was mourning the last place she had been completely safe. The first year was careful. Dale was not openly cruel in the beginning. Cruelty that begins openly rarely takes hold the way cruelty does, that starts as something else. In the beginning, he was merely difficult, demanding. He had rules about the house, about noise, about cleanliness, about the way meals should be timed and plates should be arranged. He had opinions about Cassidy's schoolwork that he expressed through silences and sighs and the particular way he set down his fork when her grades were not what he considered acceptable. He did not hit her in the first year. He did not need to. The atmosphere he created was sufficient, a low, constant pressure, like the feeling before a storm, that kept Cassidy small and quiet and careful. She learned to move through the cabin without making noise. She learned to read his moods from the sound of his truck coming up the drive. She learned that certain days, Mondays after a bad week, Sundays when he'd been drinking, required a specific kind of stillness, a near invisibility, a performance of non-existence that she became very good at over time. Lena did not see this, or she saw it, and did not name it, which is a different kind of not seeing. She was happy in a way that made her incurious. She had stopped worrying about money. The flatness was gone from her eyes. She cooked dinners that were better than anything she'd made in the Yellow House, and she laughed at Dale's jokes, even the ones he told too many times, and she wore her hair differently, down more often. And she seemed to have decided, at some level below conscious thought, that the life she now had was worth protecting. This is not a condemnation. This is what people do when they have been surviving for a long time and suddenly stop having to. They put down their armor. They stop looking at the edges of the room. They are not wrong to do so. They are just, sometimes, wrong about what it is they've stopped needing to fear. By the time Cassidy was 12, the rules had become harder, and by 13, the first time Dale's hand connected with the side of her head, those rules had become something else entirely. It happened in the kitchen on a Tuesday evening in March, over a pot of soup that Cassidy had let boil over while she was doing homework at the table. The sound of his palm against her skull was flat and oddly distant, like a sound heard through water. She stood very still for a moment after, her hand braced against the counter, the soup still hissing on the stovetop, and she understood with a cold, sinking clarity that something had crossed into a new territory and could not be brought back. She did not cry. She turned off the burner and cleaned the stovetop and set the table and sat down to dinner and ate without tasting anything. And she did not look at Dale, and Dale did not apologize because he was a man who did not apologize, and Lena was at the sink with her back to both of them, washing a pan with concentrated attention, and nothing was said. Nothing was said. She did not tell anyone. This was not a decision she made. It was simply the shape of her world. The school counselor at Hatchers Creek Middle School was a tired woman named Mrs. Fogel who had 37 students on her caseload and a smile that had become automatic with repetition. The neighbors on the nearest property were half a mile down the road. There was no one in Cassidy's daily life who created the conditions for disclosure, no adult who sat with her long enough or looked at her with enough specific attention or asked questions that opened a door rather than closing one. She went to school, she came home, she made herself invisible. She kept her grades high because Dale had made it clear, in his way, that stupidity was among the things he would not tolerate. And she found, to her own surprise, that she was genuinely good at school, at the ordered logic of mathematics, at the particular freedom of reading, at writing essays that she could lose herself inside for whole evenings while the cabin was quiet, and Dale was in front of the television, and Lena was asleep in the chair she always fell asleep in by 9 o'clock. For 3 years, she endured, not passively. She was not passive by nature, but strategically in the way of someone who has accurately assessed the available options and found them all insufficient. She was not old enough to leave. She had nowhere to go. She had no money and no relatives she knew, and no friends close enough to absorb the reality of what her life was. She survived the way water survives, by finding the path of least resistance, by moving around obstacles rather than through them, by being present without being targetable. She got very good at it. She developed a particular posture, shoulders slightly rounded, chin slightly down, body language that communicated smallness without quite communicating fear. And she held it so long it became natural, and she sometimes forgot in the middle of school days that she was performing anything at all. She met a boy named Tyler Reese at the start of her sophomore year. In the fall she was 15, in the way that terrible things often begin, with something that felt like rescue. Tyler was 17, a junior, with an easy smile and a secondhand truck he'd fixed up himself, and a way of looking at Cassidy like she was worth looking at, which was not a sensation she was accustomed to. He played guitar badly and didn't care. He laughed easily and genuinely. He was not unkind. She wants this to be clear in whatever accounting of her life she has made since then. Tyler Reese was not a villain. He was a 17-year-old boy who did not understand the weight of what was happening, who did not understand that for a girl like Cassidy, in a life like hers, his attention was not merely flattering, but life-sustaining, that it was filling a space inside her that had been hollow so long she'd stopped being able to describe its shape. He was not equipped to carry that. She was not wrong to need it. These two things were both true and ultimately irreconcilable. They were together for 7 months. In February of her sophomore year, 3 weeks after her 16th birthday, she took a test she'd bought with money she'd saved from skipping lunch for 3 weeks. She sat on the floor of the gas station bathroom off Route 9, her back against the door, the fluorescent light buzzing overhead, and watched the second line appear, and felt the world rearrange itself around her into something she did not yet have the language to describe. She was 17 weeks pregnant. She calculated this with a focused, almost academic clarity, sitting there on the cold tile floor. She counted back. She identified the night. She put the test in the bottom of her bag under 3 textbooks and a gym uniform. She walked out of the bathroom, crossed the parking lot, and began the 22-minute walk home. She did not cry. She filed the information away behind a wall she'd spent years constructing, and she concentrated on putting one foot in front of the other on the shoulder of Route 9, while cars moved past her in both directions. And she thought, I need to think about this. She had no idea yet what thinking about it would mean. She had no idea yet what any of this would require her to become. She told Tyler on a Thursday afternoon in the parking lot of the school, sitting in the cab of his truck with the engine off, and she watched his face move through a sequence of emotions that told her everything she needed to know. Surprise, fear, something that was not quite calculation but was adjacent to it. He was a good person who was 17 years old, and this was larger than he could hold. He said he was sorry. He said he needed time to think. He said whatever she decided, he would support her, and this was the language of a person who has just been handed something and is already setting it down. She did not blame him then, and she does not blame him now. She got out of the truck and walked home, and that was the last real conversation they ever had. He transferred to a school in Knoxville 3 weeks later. His family had been planning to move. She had known this. She had not allowed herself to know what it meant. She did not tell Lena. The calculus of this was simple and brutal. Telling Lena meant Dale would know, and Dale knowing was a conclusion she could not permit herself to follow to its end. She had watched Dale's face when the subject of pregnancy came up, on the television, in conversation, in the abstract, and she had seen something in it, some contempt for weakness, some disgust at consequence, that told her what she needed to know without requiring specifics. She knew what a man like Dale did with a girl like her in a situation like this. She knew it in her body the way she knew his footsteps on the porch and the particular pitch of his voice when he was about to cross from irritated into something worse. She bought loose sweatshirts at the Goodwill 3 towns over. She stopped eating dinner at the table more often than she could manage without comment. She pulled double shifts of her own invisibility, invisible as herself, invisible as what she was carrying. And she held both performances simultaneously for 6 weeks, until the night Dale came home from a week at a logging site, drunk and 2 days early, and found her in the kitchen in the fluorescent light, and saw. What followed lasted 11 minutes by the clock on the microwave. She watched it, fixing her eyes on the green numbers with the focused attention of someone trying to stay inside their own body, and left her with a cut above her left eyebrow that required 4 stitches she didn't get, a bruised rib on her right side that made breathing a careful project for 6 weeks afterward, and a clarity so absolute it felt almost like calm. Lena stood in the doorway of the kitchen for some portion of those 11 minutes. Cassidy did not look at her. She was not sure what she would have seen if she had. She was not sure she wanted to know. When it was over, she went to her room, and she sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for a long time, her hands folded in her lap, and she made a series of decisions that were not emotional decisions. They were architectural ones. They were the decisions of someone designing a structure that had to hold under extreme and sustained pressure. She decided what she needed. She decided what was available to her. She decided what she was going to do. She left at 4:17 in the morning on a Thursday in April, 6 days after the night in the kitchen. She had spent those 6 days assembling what she could without being noticed. $37 she had saved across months from various small opportunities she does not detail. A sleeping bag she retrieved from the equipment shed on a morning when Dale was at the yard and Lena was at work. A flashlight, a box of crackers, 2 cans of soup she could not open without a can opener. She forgot to take 3 changes of clothing, the small paperback Bible that had been her grandmother's, which she did not read but carried because it was the only object she owned that connected her to a time before the Yellow House, before Caldwell Street, before any of this. She also took a folding knife from the kitchen drawer. She did not think she would need it. She took it anyway. She went to the Pruitt land. This was not an accident. She knew that land. She had lived adjacent to it for 5 years, had walked parts of it on long afternoons when she needed to be somewhere that wasn't inside. She knew there was a maintenance shed at the eastern edge of the property, near where a creek ran through, that Dale used for equipment storage but rarely visited in the off-season. She knew there was, beneath a section of that shed, a root cellar. She knew this because she had found it herself, 2 summers earlier, lifting a section of rotted flooring out of curiosity, shining a flashlight into the dark below, and seeing rough stone walls and a packed dirt floor, and a space that was larger than she expected, perhaps 12 feet by 10, low-ceilinged, with a wooden shelf along one wall. She had been 14 when she found it. She had registered it as interesting and moved on. She had not known then that she was finding her future. She had not known she was casing a refuge. But the information had stayed in her, cataloged and waiting, the way the mind sometimes stores things it doesn't yet have a use for, in the quiet anticipation of need. She lowered herself into the root cellar at 4:52 in the morning, with the sleeping bag and the box of crackers and the $37 and the flashlight and the knife and her grandmother's Bible. She pulled the flooring section back into place above her. She sat in the absolute dark for a moment, her back against the stone wall, her knees drawn up as close to her chest as they would go, which was not very close anymore, and she breathed, in and out, careful. Her rib ached. The dark was complete. She turned on the flashlight and looked at the space that was now her world, and she made a final decision, the last one of that long series of decisions, which was simply this. She was going to survive, not because she had a plan, not because she could see a future from where she was sitting, in the dirt, under the earth, alone at 16 with no money and no allies, and no idea what came next. She was going to survive because the alternative was to allow Dale Pruitt and the accumulated failures of every adult who had ever been responsible for her to win, and that was the one thing she found she could not tolerate. The first 2 weeks were the worst. She had underestimated several things with a thoroughness that was, in retrospect, both understandable and nearly fatal. She had underestimated the cold. April in eastern Tennessee is not winter, but at night, underground, the temperature drops to something that is indistinguishable from cruelty, and her sleeping bag was rated for temperatures 15 degrees warmer than what she encountered on the 4th night when a late cold snap moved through, and she lay curled on the dirt floor with the sleeping bag wrapped around her shoulders, fully dressed in every item of clothing she had, and shook for 6 hours without sleeping. She had underestimated her own hunger. She had not thought about water until the crackers made her thirsty, and she realized she had brought nothing to drink and spent the entirety of the second morning locating the creek she'd known was nearby and working out how to access it without being seen from the road or the cabin windows. She had not thought carefully enough about the physical demands of pregnancy on a body that was already compromised, and she would discover the specific dimensions of this miscalculation across the following weeks in ways that were frightening and humbling, and that she would endure with the same fixed inward determination she brought to everything. She established a routine because routine was the scaffolding that kept the structure upright. She woke when the light changed. She could tell dawn from the way it leaked through the cracks in the shed flooring above her, thin lines of gray that thickened slowly into something she could read time by. She emerged from the cellar twice a day, before first light and after full dark, to use the woods and to access the creek. She stretched in the small space every morning, carefully, working around the rib, working around the growing reality of her body. She rationed the crackers until they were gone, and then she had 4 days of only creek water before she worked out a solution. She is not entirely proud of, but is entirely practical. The Pruitt property bordered a small farm a quarter-mile south, and that farm had a kitchen garden that, in late April, was beginning to show early greens: kale, chard, spinach, that could be taken in small enough quantities that no one would notice, or if they noticed, would assume deer. She took only what she needed. She was scrupulous about this. She thought of it not as stealing, but as an informal and unconsented mutual aid arrangement, and she suspects the woman who kept that garden, a widow named Paulette Gerard, 71 years old, who she would not meet for many more weeks, would have consented had she known. She had been in the root cellar for 19 days when she heard Dale's voice directly above her. She was lying on the sleeping bag at mid-morning with the flashlight off to conserve the batteries, her eyes open in the dark, counting her own heartbeats the way she sometimes did when sleep wouldn't come. And she heard the shed door open and his boots on the floor, and his voice. He was on the phone, she gathered, talking about equipment, about a rental that hadn't been returned. And she lay completely still with her hand over her mouth and counted the heartbeats and listened to him move around the shed for what was 8 minutes and 45 seconds before the door closed again and the sound of his boots receded across the gravel toward the cabin. She did not move for another 20 minutes. When she finally moved, she was shaking, not from cold, and she pressed her palms flat against the packed earth floor until she stopped. This is the part of the story that is almost impossible to hold in the mind without flinching. She was hiding, underground, in absolute darkness, carrying a child, while the man who had put her there moved freely above her in the daylight. She was 16 years old. She had $37, minus what she'd spent on nothing because there was nowhere to spend it, which meant she still had $37, and they were doing her no good at all. She had a flashlight with batteries she measured in hours remaining. She had creek water and stolen chard, and her grandmother's Bible and a folding knife she still did not think she would need. She had nothing else, and yet she did not come out, because above the surface was Dale's world, and below the surface, in the dark and the cold and the dirt, was the only space that was entirely hers. She counted time by the quality of light through the floorboards. She measured weeks by physical changes in her own body, which were becoming impossible to ignore. She developed a system for managing the dampness, rotating her clothing, drying items against her skin when she slept, which worked imperfectly and left her with a low-grade chill that became so constant she stopped distinguishing it from normal. She read her grandmother's Bible in the flashlight beam. All of it, slowly, not for spiritual comfort precisely, but for the company of the language, for the sensation of being somewhere else, someone else's story. She found she preferred the Psalms for reasons she couldn't fully articulate. Something about the tone, someone crying out from a very small dark place and being heard. The weeks moved. May became June. June became July. The light through the floorboards changed color with the seasons, became fuller and longer, and she tracked this the way sailors once tracked stars, as information, as navigation, as proof that the world was still turning even though she was not in it. Paulette Gerard found her in the first week of July. Not in the cellar. Cassidy was in the garden in the 45 minutes before dawn, on her knees in the damp soil with her hands in the chard, and she looked up and there was a woman standing at the edge of the garden in a housecoat and slippers, holding a flashlight pointed at the ground between them, looking at Cassidy with an expression that was not anger and not surprise and not the thing Cassidy had been most afraid of, which was a kind of recognition that would lead immediately to a phone call to a person Cassidy did not want called. It was instead something softer and more terrible, because Cassidy had not been looked at with simple human concern in so long that she did not at first know what she was seeing. The woman was short and broad, with white hair cut close to her head and hands that were dark and calloused and mapped with the raised veins of someone who had worked outdoors for decades. She looked at Cassidy the way you look at an injured animal, carefully, without sudden movement, trying to understand what it needed and what would make it run. She said, "How long have you been out here?" And Cassidy, who had been alone underground for 78 days, heard these words. Not the dramatic question she'd feared, not the accusation, not the name she didn't want said. Just the simplest human inquiry. How long have you been out here? And something happened that she had not planned and could not have predicted, which was that she began to cry. Not quietly, not the controlled private crying she had taught herself over years, chin down, no sound, over quickly. She cried the way the creek ran after 3 days of heavy rain, loudly, her face going red and ugly with it, her hands still dirty from the garden, her whole body doing the work of 6 months of accumulated terror and loneliness and cold and hunger and fear. And Paulette Gerard did not step back, and she did not reach for a phone, and she did not say anything for a long time. She just stood there with her flashlight pointed at the ground and let Cassidy finish. Then she said, "Come inside. Let's get you something to eat." It was that simple, or it looked that simple. The simplicity was Paulette herself. 71 years of living, 3 children raised, 1 husband buried, every variety of hardship absorbed and survived, and at the end of all of it, a woman who had become the thing that most people only aspire to, which was genuinely unshockable in the presence of suffering. She had, she told Cassidy later, seen the chard being taken and known it was a person and left it alone because whoever was taking it carefully, which meant they were frightened, and frightened people didn't need to be confronted. They needed to be waited for. She had been waiting. She had left extra kale in the most accessible corner of the garden. She had kept her kitchen light on in the early mornings in case. She had not called anyone. She had waited. This was either wisdom or stubbornness, Paulette said, and at her age, it was sometimes difficult to tell the difference. She fed Cassidy. This requires more words than it seems to, because the feeding was not a simple act. It was the first proper meal Cassidy had eaten in 78 days, and it was biscuits and butter and fried eggs and a glass of cold milk, and Cassidy ate it at Paulette's kitchen table in the pale morning light, with the particular focused solemnity of someone for whom food has become purely biological, stripped of all its social meaning. And Paulette sat across from her with a cup of coffee and did not make her talk until she was finished. When she was finished, she said, "I need you to tell me what's happening. Not to make a report," she said, "not to make a call. Just so I know what we're dealing with," Cassidy told her. She told her all of it in the flat declarative way of someone who has been holding a story so long that the act of telling it is more relief than vulnerability. The cabin, the kitchen, the 11 minutes on the clock, the root cellar, the 78 days. She told her about the baby. She was 23 weeks along by her own careful counting. And she told her about Tyler, and she told her that she could not go back, and she told her why. Paulette listened to all of it. She refilled Cassidy's milk glass once. When Cassidy was done, Paulette was quiet for a moment, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup, looking at the table. Then she looked up and she said, "You're not going back there." And that was the entirety of her response to everything Cassidy had told her, and it was enough. What Paulette Gerard did over the next 8 weeks is the kind of thing that makes people say they believe in God, or in goodness, or in the essential reliability of human beings when pressed far enough into someone else's need. She had no resources that were extraordinary. She was a widow on a fixed income in a small house on a property she managed alone. She had a spare bedroom that had been her youngest daughter's and that still had a pine chest at the foot of the bed with the daughter's initials carved into the lid. She had a telephone and a 60-year collection of the kind of practical knowledge that only comes from having needed to solve problems without anyone to call. She had, it turned out, a friend in Knoxville who was a nurse midwife who had been her friend since 1974, who drove out on a Saturday in August and examined Cassidy in the spare room and said everything was as good as could be expected and some things were better, and who left behind a list of what would be needed and a phone number to call when the time came, and who asked no questions that Cassidy was not ready to answer. Paulette helped Cassidy build a plan, not a dramatic plan, a practical one. There was a county program. Paulette had looked into this herself before Cassidy came inside, having correctly identified what she was probably dealing with, that provided housing assistance for minors in unsafe domestic situations. There was, 60 miles north, a residential facility for young mothers that provided shelter and prenatal care and, afterward, job training. There were people who could be called in a specific order in a way that Paulette had worked out in advance. What there was not in this plan was a return to Dale Pruitt's cabin, or a conversation with Lena that Cassidy was not in control of. Paulette was clear about this. She was clear about a number of things, in her short-sentenced, practical, entirely unromantic way. She was clear that what had happened to Cassidy in that kitchen was a crime. She was clear that Cassidy was not responsible for any of it. She was clear that the child Cassidy was carrying was not a punishment or a consequence, but a person, and that persons deserved to be welcomed, and that she, Paulette, planned to do her part of the welcoming when the time came. She called Cassidy stubborn once, with something that was not quite a smile, but was the ghost of one. She said, "You built yourself a house underground. Most people would have walked back in through the front door." Cassidy said she'd considered it. Paulette said, "I know you did." Then she said, "I'm glad you didn't." This was the closest either of them came to discussing what might have happened if Cassidy had gone back. They did not need to discuss it. They both understood the arithmetic. The baby came on a Sunday morning in late September, in the spare room with Paulette's nurse midwife friend and Paulette herself, and it was long and frightening in the way that births always are. And at the end of it, Cassidy was holding a daughter, 4 pounds 14 ounces, born 6 weeks early, with a shock of dark hair and a cry that was small but absolutely determined. And she looked at this person she had made in the dark, underground, for 6 months, and she felt something move through her that she had no word for then, and has never found a precise word for since. It was not simply love, though it was that. It was something older and more structural, something like the sensation of a foundation being poured and setting, something like the feeling of the ground becoming solid under feet that have been unsure of it for a very long time. She named her daughter Wren. She had decided this while she was in the root cellar, lying in the dark, her hands on her growing belly, thinking about things that could exist in small cramped spaces and still be capable of flight. The residential facility was 62 miles from Hatcher's Creek and might as well have been 600. It was called Oak Ridge Family Center, a name that suggested institutional carpeting and motivational posters, which was accurate, but also something less easily named, a specific quality of the air in a building where people are trying, where effort is being made, where the commitment to doing better is at least genuine, if not always adequate. Cassidy arrived in October, 6 days after Wren was born, still sore, still exhausted, still carrying the slightly stunned expression of someone who has survived something they were not entirely sure they would survive, with her daughter in a car seat that Paulette had bought, and her few possessions in a single bag, and Paulette sitting beside her in the front seat for the 62-mile drive, not talking much, one hand on the wheel, and one hand occasionally reaching over to put it briefly over Cassidy's without comment. She stayed at Oak Ridge for 14 months. She earned her GED in the spring, 9 months after arriving, passing every section on the first attempt. She worked in the facility's childcare program while Wren was in the on-site nursery, learning the work from the inside and finding, to her genuine surprise, that she was good at it, that she had a particular patience with frightened children, a specific instinctive ability to read the signals that children give before they escalate, a way of being present without being overwhelming that the director commented on twice in her first 6 months. She took a community college course in early childhood development on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, sitting in a fluorescent lit classroom with 17 other students, Wren at the on-site nursery until 8 o'clock, and she thought sometimes, sitting in that classroom, of the flashlight beam in the root cellar and the Bible and the rationed crackers, and she thought, I did that. I held all of that. I can hold this too. She was not okay. Let the record show this clearly, because it is important. She was not okay in the way that people who use the word healing sometimes imply, as if healing is a state one arrives at and then inhabits cleanly. She had nightmares. She had a startled response to unexpected loud sounds that lasted for years. She had a physical reaction, a cold tightening across her chest, a primitive alarm, when she heard a man's boots on a floor above her. She saw a counselor at the facility on Wednesday mornings, a young woman named Dr. Torres, who had a direct manner and asked questions that Cassidy sometimes answered and sometimes could not, and who was patient about both. She was not okay, and she was building something. These are not contradictory. She held them simultaneously, the same way she had held her own weight underground. She left Oak Ridge the following December, just before Wren's first birthday, with her GED, 48 college credits, a part-time job secured at a Head Start program in Morristown, and a room in a house she'd found through a bulletin board at the college. $380 a month, utilities included, a landlady named Mrs. Park, who did not mind children if they were quiet, which Wren mostly was. She was 17 years old. She had a daughter who was learning to walk, pulling herself up on the edge of the coffee table with the focused, effortful determination of someone who has been told nothing is impossible. She had a bank account with $214 in it. She had Paulette's phone number written on a piece of paper in her wallet and programmed into a cell phone Paulette had bought her, prepaid, before she left. She had a life that was not the one she had expected to have. She was not sure yet what she thought about it. She had the sense, not optimism, not peace, something more fundamental than either, that she was pointed in a direction that was worth walking. The years that followed were not easy, and they were not poetic. They were the years of doing the work, not the dramatic, recognizable work of crisis survival, but the grinding, unromantic work of building a life from a starting point of almost nothing, with a child at 17 in a world that is not organized to assist this process. She worked the Head Start job and added a second job at a daycare center on weekends. She took classes at the community college on evenings and eventually transferred to a 4-year program at a state university 30 miles from Morristown, commuting in a secondhand car she bought for $1,400 with a loan from Paulette that she paid back over 18 months, $25 at a time. She studied early childhood education and psychology. She worked 30 hours a week. She raised Wren. These 3 things occupied every hour of every day for 4 years, and the word tired does not begin to cover the texture of that time, the specific quality of exhaustion that is not just physical but cellular, a tiredness that lives in the bones and behind the eyes and in the slight delay between having a thought and being able to express it. Paulette came to her graduation. She sat in the bleachers in the gymnasium of the State University on a Saturday in May, Wren beside her in a dress Paulette had bought with a sash that kept coming untied, and Cassidy walked across the stage in a robe that was slightly too long for her and heard her name called and shook the dean's hand and looked out into the gymnasium and found them, the white-haired woman and the 4-year-old girl. And something in her chest completed a circuit that had been open for a very long time. She was 21 years old. She had a degree. She had a job offer, a real one, a full-time early childhood program coordinator position at a nonprofit in Knoxville with benefits, with a salary that seemed to her, when she read the offer letter, almost fictional in its adequacy. She accepted it. She moved to Knoxville with Wren, who was 4 and insisting on carrying her own backpack, who was already demonstrating the particular personality that would define her, direct, curious, fearlessly literal in the way of children who have been raised by someone who did not traffic in comfortable fictions. They found an apartment with 2 bedrooms and a window that faced east and let in the morning light. She did not think about Dale Pruitt or Lena most days. She had made a choice, not the choice that is called forgiveness, not yet, not for a long time, to put them somewhere inside herself where they could exist without consuming anything she needed to use. This was not peace. It was a kind of controlled containment, like a levee, and it worked for years because she did not push against it, and neither did they. She had heard nothing from Lena. She had heard through the attenuated gossip network of Hatcher's Creek, through someone who knew someone who'd run into someone, that Dale had sold the property at some point, that they had moved, that things were not good, that the specifics were not available. She did not look further. She was busy surviving, and surviving did not leave room for reckoning. Wren was 7 when she asked the first question. They were in the kitchen of the Knoxville apartment on a Tuesday evening, making dinner, Cassidy at the stove and Wren at the table, doing homework with the focused frown she brought to everything that required reading. Without looking up from the worksheet, Wren said, "How come I don't have grandparents? My friend Aaliyah has 4 grandparents. We only have Paulette." Cassidy did not answer immediately. She stood at the stove with the wooden spoon in her hand, and she felt the levee strain slightly under the question's simple weight. She said, "Paulette counts for at least 4 regular grandparents." Everyone agreed on this. Wren looked up. She said, "That's not a real answer." Cassidy turned to look at her daughter, 7 years old, with dark eyes and a frown that was entirely her own, no resemblance to anyone, entirely herself. And she said, "I know. We'll talk about it when you're older." Wren looked at her for a moment with the evaluative attention of a child who has been raised by someone who does not lie to her and therefore knows when a real answer is being deferred. Then she went back to her worksheet. She did not forget. She was the kind of person who did not forget things, which was one of many ways in which she was her mother's daughter. She was 12 when she asked again, differently, not a question, but a statement. She said, "I think something happened to you when you were young that you've never told me about." And Cassidy, who was 31 by then, and who had spent 15 years building the kind of self that could look at difficult things directly, said, "You're right." She said, "I'll tell you." She did not tell her everything. Not yet. Not at 12. But she told her enough. Enough for Wren to understand the root cellar and the cold and the flashlight. Enough for Wren to understand Paulette and the kitchen at dawn and the biscuits and the eggs. Enough for Wren to understand that her mother had come from somewhere hard and had walked a very long distance from it and had made something with her own hands and her own will out of nothing. Wren listened without interruption, which was unusual for her. When Cassidy finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I would have wanted to know you then." And Cassidy could not speak for a moment. She said, "I think you would have helped." And Wren said, "I know I would have." It was Wren who found out about the petition. She was 16, the same age Cassidy had been when she went underground, and she had a particular habit, characteristic of her generation, of researching things extensively before mentioning them. She had been researching Hatcher's Creek and the Pruitt property, and Dale Pruitt, who had died 4 years earlier of liver disease, which was information that landed in Cassidy's chest with a complicated weight that she did not immediately know what to do with. The petition was a legal matter involving the Pruitt property, 32 acres that Dale had sold, and that were now the subject of an environmental dispute. And in the course of researching it, Wren had found something else. She had found Lena. Not the current location, not an address, but evidence of existence. A name on a document, an affidavit related to the property sale, a date. Lena Pruitt, formerly Merritt, living in a county 20 miles from Hatcher's Creek, 61 years old, apparently alone. Cassidy did not act on this information immediately. She carried it for 8 months, turning it over the way you turn over a stone you found in a path, slowly, examining it from multiple angles, not sure yet whether to put it back down or to pick it up properly and carry it. She talked to Dr. Torres, whom she still saw twice a month, who asked the question she always asked, which was, "What do you want from this?" And Cassidy did not have a ready answer, which meant the question was the right one. She thought about it for 8 months. What she arrived at, eventually, was not closure. She had long since stopped believing in closure as anything other than a word that people use when they mean they want the past to stop mattering, which it doesn't do simply because you want it to. What she arrived at was something more specific. She wanted her daughter to know where she came from. She wanted Wren to have the full picture of her own history, not the edited version that fit within what Cassidy could manage at any given time. She wanted to see her mother's face. She did not know, past that, what she wanted. She decided it was enough. She drove to the county, 20 miles from Hatcher's Creek on a Saturday morning in March, with Wren in the passenger seat, who was 16 and had asked to come and had been told she could if she understood that nothing was guaranteed about how this would go. Wren said she understood. She had brought a book, which she held in her lap without opening. She watched the landscape change through the window, the interstate giving way to state highway, the state highway narrowing to county road, the landscape becoming less managed and more itself, hills pressing in on both sides, the woods still bare from winter, the light coming in at angles that were different here, older feeling somehow, heavier. Cassidy drove. She did not speak much. She was doing the calculus again, the same quiet architectural calculation she had always done when the available options were insufficient, and the way forward was unclear, and the only thing she could control was whether she kept moving. The house was not what she expected, and she realized as she turned into the drive that she had been expecting the yellow house on Caldwell Street, some version of it, the original before time, and what was here instead was a small prefabricated house on a half-acre lot, white with brown trim, with a porch that was not sagging but was bare. No chairs, no plants, no evidence of inhabitation beyond a pair of rubber boots by the door. The yard was neat in the way of yards that are cared for functionally, without affection. There was a single maple tree to the left of the house that had not yet leafed out, its branches making a precise, dark pattern against the white sky. She sat in the car for 3 minutes. Wren sat beside her without saying anything. Then Cassidy got out. Lena opened the door before she knocked. She had heard the car. She was standing in the doorway in jeans and a gray sweater, and she was 61 years old, and she was smaller than Cassidy remembered. Not shorter, but less substantial, as if something structural had been removed from inside her. And her dark eyes, which Cassidy had her daughter's eyes, had the flatness back in them, deeper now, settled into permanence. She looked at Cassidy for a long moment without speaking. Then she looked at the car, at the girl visible in the passenger seat, and something crossed her face that was too complicated to name. She said, "I didn't think you'd come." Cassidy said, "I wasn't sure I would." Lena looked at her. She said, "She looks like you." Cassidy said, "She's better." They went inside. The house was clean and spare, with the particular quality of spaces that are kept for one person and only one person. Everything within reach, nothing arranged for an audience, a single cup on the drying rack, a single chair angled toward the television. There were no photographs. Cassidy noticed this first and spent a moment sitting with what it meant. Then she sat at the small kitchen table, and Lena made coffee and they talked for 4 hours. It was not a reconciliation in the way that word is usually meant. It was not tearful, and it was not complete, and it did not resolve everything or most things, or perhaps even a majority of things. What it was a conversation between two women who had been through the same fire from different sides, who had survived it differently, who had paid different prices for their survival and made different bargains and lived differently in the aftermath. Lena said, "I should have left him the night he hit you the first time." Cassidy did not say it would have changed everything because she wasn't sure it was true. She said, "Yes." She said, "I needed you to." Lena said, "I know." She said, "I was a coward." She said it the way people say true things they have rehearsed for a long time, plainly, without ornamentation, looking at the table. Cassidy did not say it was okay. It was not okay. She said, "I know." They talked about what happened after. Lena had known, eventually, where Cassidy had been. Not at the time, but years later, from piecing things together, from a conversation with Gerald Haynes at some point, who had mentioned finding the girl in the woods behind the Pruitt land. She had not come. Cassidy asked why. Lena was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I told myself you were better off." She said, "I think I was telling myself something easier than the truth." The truth, she said, was that she was ashamed. That the shame was so large she could not see around it to do the thing she should have done, which was to come and get her daughter and take her somewhere safe. She said, "I think I was afraid that you wouldn't come." Cassidy looked at her. She said, "You would have been right." Wren came in at some point. She had been reading in the car for an hour and then had let herself in through the unlocked door without announcement and was sitting in the living room chair with her book. And Lena looked at her granddaughter for the first time, and the flatness in her eyes shifted into something that was not its opposite, but was adjacent to it. Something that recognized that it was not entirely too late. Wren said hello in the direct, unadorned way she always said hello to people, and sat down, and they all sat in the small kitchen and drank coffee. And outside, the maple tree moved slightly in the wind against the white sky, and no one said anything for a while, and this was its own kind of communication. They drove home in the late afternoon. The light was lower, the shadows longer on the road, the hills on either side going dark at their bases, while their tops still held the last of the day. Wren read her book. Cassidy drove. After 40 minutes, Wren put down the book and looked out the window and said, "She's alone." Cassidy said, "Yes." Wren said, "Are you going to see her again?" Cassidy thought about it. She said, "I don't know yet." Wren nodded. She said, "I think you should." She said it not as a prescription, but as an observation, in the tone she used when she had considered something thoroughly and arrived at a conclusion she was confident in. She said, "I think you've both been alone with it long enough." Cassidy did not respond immediately. She drove. The county road straightened out, and the hills fell back, and the light was almost gone from the sky, and the first stars were appearing, faint and tentative, at the eastern edge. She thought about the root cellar. She thought about the flashlight beam and the Bible and the $37 and the crack of light through the floorboards at dawn. She thought about Paulette's kitchen in the dark of early morning, and the biscuits and the eggs and the glass of cold milk, and the simplest possible question asked with the fullness of human concern. "How long have you been out here?" She thought about the sound of her daughter crying for the first time in a spare room in Paulette's house, small and furious and absolutely alive. She thought about all the years between that morning and this one. The grinding years, the hard years, the years of the 2 jobs and the night classes and the second-hand car and the $214 in the bank account and the east-facing window. And she thought about the word she had never been comfortable using, the word that got said too easily by people who had not been asked to do it, the word that sounded like an erasure of what happened, but was, when practiced correctly, actually its opposite. Not an erasure, a choice. A decision made about where to direct the limited energy of a finite life. She said to Wren, "You're probably right." Wren said, "I know." And something that had been held in Cassidy for 30 years, not all of it, not most of it, but a piece of it, one specific piece, shifted slightly, like a stone moved by water. Not dramatically, not with any sound, just moved, in the way that things move when the conditions finally become what they need to be. She drove. The stars became more certain overhead. The road unspooled in the headlights, pale and straight. She called Paulette that night, which was a thing she had done nearly every week for 22 years, because some debts are not debts at all, but are the foundations of love. And Paulette said, "How did it go?" And Cassidy said, "I don't know yet." And Paulette said, "That sounds about right." She asked about Wren, and Cassidy told her what Wren had said in the car, and there was a silence on the line that was comfortable and full, the silence of 2 people who know each other so completely that silence communicates as much as words. And then Paulette said, "That girl. That is one extraordinary girl." And Cassidy said, "I know where she got it." And Paulette laughed, the short, dry laugh of a woman who does not accept compliments gracefully but accepts them. And they talked for another 20 minutes about nothing important, about the weather and a show they'd both been watching, and whether Wren's school play was the week after next or the week after that. And when they hung up, the apartment was quiet, and Wren was asleep, and the east-facing window was dark, but would fill with light in the morning, as it always did, as it had done every morning for the 4 years they'd lived in this apartment, reliable and unhurried, the light coming the way it comes. Not suddenly, but insistently, filling the dark by degrees, until there is more light than dark, and then more, and then finally, the full day. There is a thing that happens when you have survived something that was not supposed to be survivable. You carry it differently at different ages. At 16, you carry it like a wound, raw, specific, located in the body. At 21, you carry it like a tool, a thing that made you capable of something, though you are not yet sure what. At 35, you carry it like a scar, permanent, familiar, no longer painful to the touch, though you are aware of it in certain weathers. The carrying does not end. This is the thing that is hardest to explain to people who have not done it. The carrying does not end, but it changes, and what it changes into, over decades of doing the work, of showing up, of choosing, day after day, to build rather than collapse, is something that functions almost like strength. Not the kind of strength that looks like invulnerability, the kind that looks like a woman driving home on a county road at dusk, with her daughter beside her, having done the hard thing, having said the difficult words, having opened a door she was not sure she could open, and still driving, still moving forward, still choosing. If you are watching this, And something in this story lives in a place inside you that you recognize. If you have ever built a house underground because the surface was too dangerous, if you have ever made yourself invisible to survive, if you have ever been discarded by the people who were supposed to claim you, I want you to hear this. What you built in the dark was real. The person you became in the difficult years is not a lesser version of you. It is the full version, the one who knows what you're capable of because you have already done the hardest thing. The light through the floorboards was always there. You were always going to find your way to it. And when you do, when you finally come up out of the dark and someone asks you, simply, without judgment, without agenda, how long have you been out here? It is okay to let that be enough. It is okay to cry. It is okay to go inside and sit down at someone's table and let them feed you. That is not weakness. That is the bravest thing. That is the whole point. Ren was born in a root cellar, underground, in the dark, 6 months after her mother went into hiding, and she learned to fly.